and get that worked out. Thank them so much for coming and singing. They sang during revival. It's just been a great week, so we thank them so much for that. Does anybody recognize this name? Some of you do? Okay. How many? Raise your hand if you know. Okay. I'm not even going to try to say it. Okay. I didn't, but you'll recognize what he's most famous for. Put up that next slide. The people that raised their hand, was that who you thought it was? Okay. He wrote The Three Musketeers, the most famous adventure novel ever written. It takes place, it's a setting, 17th century France. How do you say that? D'Artagnan, see. I just saw the movie, I didn't read the book. D'Artagnan, the set is, he goes to France, goes to Paris to earn his fortune, and he meets up with the Three Musketeers, and they're devoted to each other, and he comes into this group, and there's three of them. Athos, I'm just making these how you pronounce them up. He was the oldest and the most noble. He was somewhat mysterious in his ways. Porthos, he was large, he was the muscular, boastful, very loyal though. And Aramis, he was the handsome one, the cultured one. But he was always torn between his religious devotion and leading a soldier's life. So that was always backing up. And of course, we can say it, you can say it, the motto. Say it with me. All for one and one for all. You know, if you didn't even see the movie or read the book, you know that. But do you catch the subtle irony of being able to say all for one and one for all? All four were so different. But still they could click their swords together and say that motto, all for one and one for all. They were different, but they could come together and be united in this one thing. You know, all for one and one for all is a great motto, a great description, rather, of the church. You know, church actually means the assembly, the called out ones, the gathering of Christians. And today, with it being Homecoming Sunday, I thought it was a great time just to look at a passage in Ephesians 4 where it talks about the church, where it celebrates the church. And we're going to turn there in just a little bit. But homecoming is today. And I did a little bit of looking back in the history of homecoming services at church. It's traditionally pretty much a southern tradition. That doesn't surprise you at all, that we create a holiday so we could eat. It doesn't surprise us a bit. It's a tradition that primarily came from the time in our history where people were not as mobile. We didn't travel as easily as we do now. And people would move away or get married and start going to another church. But there was always going to be that one Sunday, no matter whether you moved away or just lived and went to another church, you came back to the church of your heritage, where your faith began. Here at Macedonia, when I first started coming here, almost 35 years ago now, the homecomings were just unbelievable. That there would be 400 people in here and 600 people outside. You know, it was that excuse to say I went to church, but I didn't have to go in church. You know, but it would be 800 or more people here. And food everywhere, and it was just almost overwhelming to see that. Well, homecomings have over the years, because we are a more mobile society. You know, you didn't just come home one Sunday or one time a year, things like that. A lot of churches have even stopped having their homecoming meal and such. So the significance of the homecoming has waned over the years, but the significance of the church, where your faith began, those things has not waned. The church is as important, as significant as it's ever been. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a passage of Scripture that talks about the church. So in your Bibles, on the screen, Ephesians chapter 4, we'll start with verse 1. As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. I said this 2 weeks ago when I preached. Again, when we read Scripture, context is king. And maybe we need to say that and be reminded of it every week. And what I mean by that is when we read something, when we hear something, know the context. It not only makes us more correct in what we say and believe, but it also helps us actually gain more value to know the context in which something is said. And in Ephesians here, the first 3 chapters, Paul has been dealing with the doctrine of what Jesus has done for us, the salvation doctrine, what Jesus has done to bring the Jew and the Gentile to Christ. But this is the pivotal point in the letter where he switches from what Christ has done to what our response as Christians is to be. We move from doctrine to duty. And so that's where he's picking up here. And so I just want to look at some of the phrases here. In verse 1, he says, as a prisoner of the Lord. And this can have a dual meaning because Paul was actually a prisoner as he wrote this. He was a prisoner because of Christ. But Paul viewed himself as a prisoner to the Lord. That his whole life was surrendered and given to the Lord. So it's a dual meaning here. Prisoner to and prisoner for the Lord. He says, I urge you to. And that word there, it just means implore. I plead with you. I invite you to come alongside, to grab hold, to carry the weight, to help carry the weight, carry your weight. It's a strong, strong term. But it's not a term in the sense of let me check this off and then I can move on to something else. He's saying, I urge you to take hold, to be a part of this. He goes on, he says, I urge you to live a life worthy of your calling. The Christian, the church, was called out, the called out ones. And it's not just a few. We hear that phrase. We use that phrase sometimes. Well, he was called to the ministry. He was called to do this. What he's talking about here is that everybody that come to know the Lord, became a Christian, is called out. When Peter preached on the day of Pentecost and he said, repent and be baptized, every one of you, it says that 3,000 people were baptized that day. And he goes on, he says, come out of this generation, those who will be lost. Let me tell you, it wasn't a few that were called that day. All 3,000 were called that day. They were called out of that. How many, some of you, see if you agree with me, how many of you think that one of the greatest television shows ever made is the Andy Griffith Show? All right, you agree? Yeah, you agree. How many of you still watch it today? All right, you've seen every episode at least 50 times, One of my favorite lines in the whole series of the Andy Griffith Show is when Andy would talk to Barney, and it always had to be Gomer or Goober, and he would say something like, now act like you got some smarts. I love that line. And our parents, and if you're a parent, you've used the same line, may not the same, but you have said many times, act like you got some sense. My mom was, now don't embarrass me. Go out, don't embarrass me. That type of thing. And we're all appealing that. Paul is appealing, and his is a much more spiritual appeal. But he's saying, be who you are. Realize who you are. You are the called out ones. Now act like it. It's serious business to realize that we are called out of something and then to realize that it carries weight in how we live. They're not compartmentalized. We're reminded of that, what we see in culture and what we see in sports, that somebody, an NFL star, a baseball star, he can be playing great football or great baseball, but he does something in his private life, gets arrested, does something terrible, and they will end his contract. They say, we do not want you representing our team. We see that when when people go on social media and post things. It has nothing to do with the job they have, but they go on and post things that are very insensitive, very embarrassing to their company. Their company calls them and says, we do not want you representing our company anymore, and they fire them. See, that's a great reminder to us that we do not live compartmentalized lives, that I can say I'm a Christian here, but I can act any way I want to over here because I'm not over there at the church. Everything is connected. It's compartmentalized. And Paul here is saying, be who you are. It's serious business. Christian means belonging to Christ, follower of Christ. That name Christian first did not start among Christians. It was a label that people outside of the church, outside of Christ, says, oh, they're doing it. They're Christians. They're small Christ. They're small Jesus. And that was, and the church then finally said, that's a pretty good description of what we are. We're of Christ. And they started calling themselves Christian because it was a great identity. Jay Hardison, one night of our revival this week, and his message gave us the little Jesus and asked you to carry it with you. And carry that wherever you go. Take a little Jesus with you wherever you go. And some of the people this week have sent me some text with a picture of where they carried their little Jesus. One person showed me that they led their staff in devotions one morning this week, and they had their little Jesus sitting right there on their devotion book. Irvin and Susan were out to breakfast one morning, and as they were talking with the waitress, they found out she was really struggling with the loss of her mother. And so Irvin gave her his little Jesus for her to take. One person sent me the picture. They were at a doctor's appointment, find out what they were going to have to do if they'd have surgery, and they had Jesus with them there. I received others after I'd made the slideshow, but little Jesus was at the beach this week. Jesus was at a ball field working in the concession stands, and on and on. We do not compartment our lives. That's why Paul says this in verse 3. He says, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Effort. It's not something that just happens. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. No, it says you work, you do it, you put out an effort, you even strain and struggle to make it happen. I love this. It says keep the unity. It doesn't say establish unity because Christ has already created unity in the church. He brought us all together. He brought the Jew and the Gentile together. He brought peace between mankind and God. He's created the unity. He's created the peace, but we have a responsibility to keep it, to do what is necessary to keep it. Homecoming really made me think about this, that kind of my history through church. They opened or started a little basement church. You can see it right from our house. So we started attending church there. And I was very young, and so the church, very small, and it struggled to make ends meet. And they finally decided to close the doors and merge with another smaller church just a few miles down the road. Now, I was young, naive. I didn't understand the inner workings of any of that, but the church really struggled with a lot of things. My dad and another neighbor, like I say, we could see across from my house, across where this little church was. They were cleaning out everything, and they had the piano in the back of a pickup truck. And they'd been arguing about were they just going to give it away, donate it, or sell it, and they couldn't decide what to do. And my dad and a buddy was sitting there, and they backed the truck out into the highway, dumped the piano out of the truck, and it splintered into 1,000 pieces right there in the road. And one of the guys said, he said, that's just poetic justice right there. He said they couldn't get along when they were playing the piano, and they couldn't even get along with what they were going to do with the piano. And I was young. I didn't know any of the struggles there. We started going to this other small church. It was very small, and it struggled, but we hired a preacher and his family, and they really put an emphasis on reaching out to people, and the church grew. And for the first time in my life, we had young people coming from my school, and we just looked forward to being at church and other kids being there and stuff. And it was great. But then they fired the preacher. And that church, it was on an upward went right back down to that struggle level, and it struggles still today. And I remember at 16 years old, that was a pivotal time in my life because I lost faith in the church then. I never lost faith in God, but I lost faith in the church. And for about 2 years, a little over 2 years, I just visited with friends at their churches. I never stayed home, but I always went, but I never connected with a church. A girl invited me to go to her church. Guess what I did? Went to her church. Very spiritual reasons to go to her church. Went to her church, and it turned out to be the County Line Christian Church. Those people brought me in. They invited me in. They put their arms around me. They made me feel like I had been there my entire life. I got to working with the youth there, just everything, and it reestablished my faith in the church. It was during that time that I decided to go to Bible college. And at Bible college, 1979, in Bible college, they were sending me a check, $40 a month to help with my school. And then one summer, I worked Vacation Bible School back, and they surprised me by giving me the VBS offering to help pay for my school. Now, I remember that from then through that, I always said, I do not want to disappoint these people. I want to be a person worthy of their support. $40 in 1979 was a lot of money. And I did not want to let them down. Now, to be fair, in that small, struggling church that I'd been in, it was there that I did meet youth, and it was part of a youth group that helped me through some tougher years. But never underestimate the value and the impact that a church that is living and working in unity and peace has on people, or what the opposite, a church that does not live in unity, the adverse effect that it can have on a person. Me personally, that was the pivotal time of whether I engaged or walked away. I skipped verse 2 when we were working through. Let's go back to it. It says, be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. You know why it's there? Because Paul knows that we would mess it up. He knows that we would mess up the unity, the church that was Christ created. And the only way to accomplish such a huge task is to have these things in our lives. It's the only way it's going to happen. Now, I'm not trying to be gross here or anything, but I want you to look at this sign that I took a picture of in a bathroom. Do not put your hand in the toilet. You know what? I didn't need a sign for that. There was never a time that I thought about putting my hand in the toilet. But you know why there's a sign that says do not put your hand in the toilet? Because somebody has put their hand in the toilet. I'm telling you, left to us, we would mess it up. Left to us, I'm telling you, we would take what Jesus described as the bride of Christ, and we would mess it up. We would take the strategic thing that Jesus said, how important the church is and how it's going to help us fight the spiritual warfare, and how we have a spiritual welfare and grow and mature, and the hope, it's a place of hope to help draw people in from being lost to being saved and giving them a family to be a part of. I'm telling you, we would mess it up. But our hope is in the unity of the faith, the unity of in the Spirit. Unity brought about because God has brought us peace. That's our hope. You know, he says there in verse 2, he says, be humble. I love that. More than a definition of humble is a lowliness of mind, not thinking too highly of yourselves. It's a character trait of that time that was looked down upon until Jesus came and he modeled it in his life. I always go back to Philippians chapter 2. Listen what it says. He says, your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. And then those next couple of verses, he says, who being in very nature God, but did not think it was something to hold on to, but yet came to earth and became as a human. Then he spins this up, little section up in 8, verse 8, he says, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. He humbled himself. Humility is something that had to be modeled for us, and Jesus did it. He says, be gentle. Gentle is not being weak, but rather strength under control. I always, when I picture gentle, I picture a big muscular father holding a baby that has the strength to cause harm, but holds that baby gentle. That doesn't mean he's weak. It means his strength is under control. You know, Eric mentioned a couple of weeks ago how our country has gone through some really, really tough times lately. A lot of shocks to our system, assassination, Charlie Kirk's assassination. I'm not here to ask you if you agreed with Charlie Kirk or you didn't agree with Charlie Kirk. I personally love to listen to him, and I thought he made some wonderful points. Top and most of all is that he said Jesus Christ was the answer to all of the things, all the problems that we have. But whether you are a Charlie Kirk fan or you were not a Charlie Kirk fan, if you watched his memorial service and when his wife stood before millions of people televised and almost 100,000 people in the arena and said, I forgive my husband's killer. The power of those words that spoke to both sides and to any side of any person, of any issue, that she had the strength in the moment to call down anything she wanted to say about this situation, and she chose to be gentle and say, I choose to forgive the person who took my baby's daddy, their father, away. That's power. Paul goes on, he says, we must be patient, to be long-tempered, not short-fused. He says we must bear with one another. I love the thought and the picture that to bear with one another is just simply saying, I'll wait for you. You've been in those situations where somebody says, yeah, I'll wait for you right here. I could go ahead, but I'll wait for you. I'll wait for you. Even though we disagree in the church on things, I'm going to wait right here. We're not going to end our relationship. I'll wait for you. One of my friends here at church told me a couple of weeks ago that he was so upset that one of his friends and his wife, that they had left the church that they had been a part of for 20 years because the preacher said something that they didn't like. And it wasn't doctrinal, it wasn't a biblical thing, it was just a stance that he took. And they left the church after 20 years. And he was just heartbroken because I can't believe they're giving up on their church. That's not being bearing with one another. That's not long-suffering. That if you don't agree with me or someone else, we don't just quit. We don't just walk away. I want to look at one more section here as we move to the end. Ephesians 4, starting with verse 4, or continuing with verse 4. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. Did you pick up on one word that's repeated over and over? One. He simplifies it and brings it all down. One. 7 times in 3 short verses he says one. Paul in other places called for people to be like-minded, not to be you don't have to agree with everything, but to be like-minded, that we agree that there's one Lord and there's one faith, all of these things. Peter did the same thing. And we do not need to confuse the two. Unity is not uniformity. Uniformity means we all do the same thing. Well, I'm telling you, in a church of any size, but especially the size of Macedonia, we're going to have Republicans, we're going to have Democrats, we're going to have independents, but yet we're all part of the church. We're going to have Duke fans, we're going to have Carolina fans, we're going to have NC State fans, we're going to have ECU fans, and we've got one Virginia fan. But that's okay. We don't have to pull for the same team. We have so even things when we go deeper than just sports and politics. There are so many preferences in the name of Christ. We like different forms of music. We like different styles of music. We wish the service times were at different times. We can disagree or agree with how the money is spent. We can disagree or agree on whether, or you may have your preference on which version of the Bible that we use, NIV or ESV. We can disagree on how we even dress when we come to church. Everybody has an opinion about that. How we act and how we allow our children to act and all the different things. So many things to divide us, but one thing to unite us. One thing that unites us. To demand that it would be my way, to be uniform with everything I believe, is selfish and unbiblical. One of the most revealing stories to me is the story of King Hezekiah in the Old Testament. He wasn't a great king. He wasn't really even a good king. But God spared his life. And he sends words to Hezekiah with a prophecy of what's going to happen in the future. And he tells him, he says, I've spared your life. He says, but let me tell you, after your life, there's going to be some tough times in Israel. You're going to be conquered by another nation. The people are going to suffer. Your own descendants, your own children's children, they're going to be taken away to another land and they will suffer. You know what Hezekiah said? 2 Kings 20:19, this is his response. The word of the Lord you have spoken is good, Hezekiah replied. He said, it's good to hear this word from the Lord. But he says, for he thought, will there not be peace and security in my lifetime? That is the most selfish response that there can be. That he's saying, oh, my children, my grandchildren, my nephews and nieces, they're going to suffer terribly. Whew, but at least it's not in my lifetime. So he's saying, just keep it the way it is and get me through my life, and then y'all can worry about yourself. Incredibly selfish attitude. And that cannot exist in the church. And thank God, I don't think it exists here. That we're all the time looking to the next generations. The next people who aren't even here in the pews yet. You can be a Hezekiah and you can watch your church decline. You can watch the church, big C, the universal church will never die. But the little C church, the locals, can really suffer if people do not have the attitude. You can watch the effectiveness slip away, or you can have a mindset like Joseph Bow. Joseph Bow was born in 1920 in Poland. Joseph had a tremendous gift of art. And so he went to university to learn art. But World War II broke out with the invasion of Poland. And of course, he had to stop going to college. His family was forced to move into what was known as the Jewish ghetto of the city. And then later they were all moved to a concentration camp. Because of a partial education and the gift that Joseph had, and the people running the concentration camp recognized his talent, he had a real talent for Gothic lettering and writing. So they put him in charge of map writing and writing, making signs for the prison, for the concentration camp. But by doing that, they put him in access to writing materials and paper. And because he was so good, he began to produce credentials, false identities, new identities for people who were in the concentration camp, that they got new papers. By him making new documents, he saved the lives of 400 Jews. And they were released because they had their proper papers. After World War II, someone asked him, so if you had this ability, why didn't you create credentials for yourself and get out? And his answer was simple. Then who would have done it for the other Jews? Who would have done it for the other Jews? My challenge to you here is this. Embrace the church. Be the church. Come alongside the church. If you're a Christian, I challenge you to make the church so much of your life that it brings blessing and balance to your life. I went to a Chris Tomlin concert last night in New Bern, and I just cry. To watch thousands of people just sing. It's one thing about a Chris Tomlin concert. When he says the first word, he can back away from the microphone because everybody else is singing. And I go, that's what I want. That's what I want to be a part of. As a church, a called out group worshiping their God. And it makes my life better. It brings balance to my life. And I want that for you and for everyone else.